Hi, my name is Ronald Thompson, and I'm on a hunt to answer the question of whether or not the Americans were justified in declaring their independence from England. I'll be going on a road trip across America to interview some of the descendants of the people that first arrived at the colonies in the New World.
Life's like a road that you travel along. There's one day here and the next day gone. Sometimes you bend, sometimes you stand, sometimes you turn your back to the wind. There's a world outside every darkened door, where blues won't haunt you anymore, where the brave are free and lovers soar. Come ride with me to the distant shore.
I've arrived in New England, and I'm here to interview one of the descendants of one of the first Puritans who came to America. Hey, I'm Ronald. Thanks for meeting me.
No problem. What can I help you with?
So I'm here to find the answer to the question whether or not the Americans were justified in declaring their independence from England. Can you tell me a little bit about the story of how your ancestors came to the New World?
Sure. My ancestors were obviously Puritan, and they were tired of not being able to worship the way that they wanted to. So when they heard about other English people going to Massachusetts and the new land, they thought it would be a great place to go and worship God the way that they wanted to. So my ancestors and another group got on a ship and headed to the new land. They arrived in Massachusetts and they started trading with the Indians that were already there. They traded furs and manufactured goods and also small gifts and toys. Their relationship started off good, but their beliefs from the Indians were too different, and that led to conflict between them.
What kind of conflict?
King Philip gathered a bunch of Indians together and attacked the Puritans. It was King Philip's War, and it was possibly one of the deadliest wars in American history. Not only their religion had an effect on this, though. The Puritans had brought over diseases from England. The Native Americans were dying because of this. They didn't want people coming into their territory spreading diseases and forcing their religion upon them. I understand that, but they also didn't want to attack my ancestors.
So, do you think that the Americans were justified in declaring their independence from England?
I think the Americans were justified. They were just trying to worship in other ways.
Thanks for letting me interview you.
No problem.
Life is a highway, I wanna ride it all night long. If you're going my way, well, I wanna drive it all night long. Through all these cities and all these...
So I talked to a descendant of one of the Puritans, and she thinks that the Americans were justified in declaring their independence from England because all they wanted to do was worship and live in peace in a new land. And so now I'm here in England to talk to a descendant of one of the English and see if he thinks that the Americans were justified in declaring their independence from England. Hey, thanks for coming. Let me interview you.
No problem, come inside.
So thanks again for coming. Let me interview you. What do you think about the Americans going over to the new land?
At first they were on board with people from Europe going over to the New World, but as more and more people started arriving, the more and more they started to separate from the rest of Europe. And many European companies sponsored the trip over to the New World, and the more people started going over, the more they became their own independent colonies.
So, do you think that the Americans were justified in declaring
What were you saying?
So, do you think that the Americans were justified in declaring their independence from England?
I don't think that they were just in declaring their independence because we were unhappy with the way that they went over and started doing things their own way when my ancestors were the ones that sent a majority of them over.
So we've talked with a descendant of one of the Puritans who thought that the Americans were justified because they just wanted to have a place where they could live and worship God in peace. And then we talked to a descendant of one of the English who thought that they weren't justified in declaring their independence because the Europeans or the English sponsored their trips over there and kind of wanted the new land to be like an extension of England, but the Americans ended up splitting off, which wasn't what the English wanted. So now we're here to talk with one of the Native Americans who is in the new land before all of them and see what they think. So thanks for letting me come talk to you about this. I'm here to find the answer to the question of whether or not the Americans were justified in declaring their independence from England. Can you tell me a little bit about the story of when the Europeans first came to what is now the American East Coast?
At first, when the Europeans came over, my ancestors were very welcoming to them, but as more and more of them came over, they started to take more of our land from us. And that caused conflict between us and them, and eventually it led to wars breaking out.
So, can you give me an example of one of the wars?
King Philip's War was the best example because it started from Europeans coming over and taking our land and then forcing their religion upon us, and a group of Native Americans got together and said that they would not stand for that anymore, and so they decided to fight back against the Europeans.
So, do you think that the Americans were justified or not in declaring their independence from England?
I don't think the Americans were just in declaring their independence because they left Europe because they weren't being treated fairly, and they came here and treated us the same way that they had been treated over in Europe. And they took our land from us, which we were happy to share with them, but they didn't let us have it, any of it, and they forced us out of it and forced religion upon us.
Hi, it's Ronald Thompson, and I have interviewed descendants of the Puritans, the English, and the Native Americans to ask them their opinion on the question of whether or not the Americans were justified in declaring their independence from England. After getting their opinions, I have come to the conclusion that the Americans were not justified in declaring their independence from England. Because even though the Puritans did just want to have their own place to worship and live freely, all the colonists who came over did kind of, they went against what the English wanted them to do, because the English were sponsoring their trips over there, and the English wanted them to make it kind of like another branch of England, but they just went against what the English thought and made it their own place. And so also the colonists came over to what was then the Native Americans' land and ended up taking a lot of the Native Americans' land and also forced their religion upon them, which wasn't fair to begin with. And after all of that, also just killed all of the Native Americans because of war and because of the diseases that they brought. So after gathering the opinions of these descendants, I have come to the conclusion that the Americans were not just in declaring their independence from England. So thanks again for coming to let me interview. So thanks again for coming So thanks again for coming to let me Sean, stop it! So thanks again for coming Sean, you're so bad at this. So, do you think that the Americans were Sean, you're so bad at this.
Well, like if you're a hobo, like I would go there.
That's like straight where I would go though.